You're not getting any younger, so
follow your values and be kind to yourself.
Hey you! Yes, you! Welcome to the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast, a podcast for people who want to disrupt their lives for a good reason, to make it count. I'm your host, Jen Glantz, and every week I'll drop a new episode with stories from real people just like you, who woke up one morning and decided to make big changes, starting with small things. We'll cover topics like entrepreneurship, love, failure, and self-care. Hey, you're not getting any younger, so let's make this an adventure. Ready? Hey you! Welcome back to another episode of You're Not Getting Any Younger. I am your host, Jen Glantz, and today we're talking about how to be happy. If anybody asked you, hey, what makes you happy? Would you know what to say? How about if they asked you what kind of person makes you happy? Would you know who to describe? Dr. Jenny Taitz is on the show today, picking apart the topic she wrote about in her book called How to Be Single and Happy, which should honestly be called How to Be Human and Be Happy, since we could all learn from her lessons. Dr. Jenny Taitz is a board-certified therapist in cognitive behavioral therapy. We sat down in her office in Beverly Hills to chat about learning how to do things solo, being honest with yourself, developing self-awareness, and what to stop doing and start doing if you want to be happy. I hope you enjoy. P.S. Thanks for listening to this pod. If you love it, your words would mean a lot, so please rate, review, subscribe on iTunes, and come hang out with us in the You're Not Getting Any Younger secret Facebook group so you can chat with other like-minded people just like yourself. I'll see you there. You published a book last year called How to Be Single and Happy. First of all, it was such a wonderful book to read. I am not single, but I still read this book almost like a textbook. I took a pen with it, and I found that on almost every other page, I was highlighting something, marking something down. It was just very relatable for almost anyone. And when I describe this book to other people, I always say the title should have been How to Be Human and Happy, because I really do think it applies to everybody. When you were in the phase of thinking about this book, what made you want to write a book called How to Be Single and Happy?
You know, that's such a great question. I talk about at the end of the book. I don't want to give this away for people that haven't taken a look yet, but a close colleague of mine, I'm really interested in putting my best work out there and making sure it's kind of quote unquote peer reviewed, that experts agree that what I'm saying is true to the latest advances in science. So I asked a friend of mine to read the book, and he sent me a pretty abrupt email saying, you really didn't write a book on being single. Let's talk about this. And that made me incredibly anxious. My final deadline was rapidly approaching. And then he sort of said something similar to what you're saying, that this book is really for anyone. But I was inspired. There's a lot of books on happiness, but I really wanted to write about how to be happy while looking for love, because I noticed a lot of clients came to see me and they sort of described, this is my first time in therapy. I've never been to therapy, and online and app-based dating or sort of dating in this time has made me feel really shitty, and I've never felt this unhappy before. And so I felt like I really needed to help people that felt like their happiness was being compromised by the dating culture, or feeling like everything was within their reach, like career, friends, health goals, but dating seemed like the one to do that was tough to tackle.
Oh, for sure. And do you find a lot of people come to you and say, well, I can't be happy until I find somebody?
I hear that all the time. And one of the clients who most inspired that book was really sort of set in that headspace. And so I actually set out this book before I started writing. It was sort of like a question, is this true? What does science say about, can you be happy without a partner? And it was sort of like an exploration for me. I was like, a lot of people are really convinced. A lot of popular TV shows and romance novels are based on this sort of premise. Is it actually true? And I was really actually surprised by how untrue it actually is.
And one of the things I really liked about this book was it wasn't a self-help book in the sense that it's like, do this, 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 and this, and you will 100% be happy. And it wasn't the kind of book that said, play this kind of game and you will find a partner. It was the kind of book that said, hey, let's talk about what's going on and let's talk about some of the things that you say to yourself over and over and over again. And I found that when I was single, a lot of the things you mentioned in your book are things that I not only told myself, but I truly believed. The first thing was, I'm going to end up alone. That's something that I think if you try dating for quite some time and it doesn't go the way you think it's going to go, you start to adopt that principle, especially if all of the friends around you are getting married, having kids. I'm going to end up alone. And that's a phrase that's very powerful, because what happens when a person says that over and over and over again?
Yeah, well, this is actually one of my favorite things to talk about, so I'm happy you asked. There's a famous research study called Anticipated Aloneness Reduces Intelligent Thought. One of my favorite mentors, his name is Roy Baumeister, did this study where he gave people math problems and asked them to complete these math problems. Then in a really persuasive way, this probably wouldn't go over with today's like review standards today, but in a persuasive way, the participants who did these math problems were told, based on changes in the population, it's more likely that you'll end up alone, and then asked them to repeat the same set of math problems, and lo and behold, they did worse. And so the second we start to think I'm going to end up alone, and especially for people that are smart and try to come up with some sort of like conclusion, like I've been dating for 10 years, no one's been great. If, it gets harder as you age, then of course I'll certainly end up alone if like my best days are behind me. It's really easy to fall into this thing of like believing the things that you think, but the second you go down that like trap, it's like the second you start in the nicest way, like losing your smarts, like, you just cannot think clearly. So the nicest thing you could do is just notice that, like, there is that thought, I'll end up alone, and just see it for what it is, just a mental event that you don't have to listen to, but that you could sort of witness, and then maybe you could do something to make yourself feel a little bit better, like, thank you, mind, for that thought. I'm going to make sure I connect tonight, or even just remind yourself of this fact that, like, first comes happiness, then comes connecting, not first comes connecting. First comes happiness, then comes love, not first comes love, then comes happiness.
The other thing I found was interesting is I was talking to my boyfriend about this after I read the book, and I said, before I met you, I was sort of convinced I would end up alone because I tried dating so much, I couldn't find anyone. I thought that maybe I was too much for people, and he said to me, that's never a thought that I had. I never thought I'd end up alone. And I said back to him, what, were you just going to settle for someone if you didn't meet perfect old me, And he just said, no, I just never thought that. And I wondered, is that a phrase that you think more women think about than men?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think something that you said, Jen, is so worth like highlighting. I think almost everyone, and this is like another thing to remember, like almost everyone that's currently happy in a relationship, or many people will acknowledge that they always thought they were going to end up alone until they met this person. And so just remembering that that's just like a human, personal sort of like spam that's going through your head, not like a predictive indicator of your future. And I think for women, it's especially common because a lot of women have an innate desire to maybe start a family, and so maybe they have a stronger sense of urgency around this. And so I certainly see this thought more often with women, but I also see men. I think whatever most matters to you is whatever you most like worry about. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that you worry about ending up alone is a sign that you care deeply about relationships, not a sign that that's actually going to happen.
Yeah, I found that very, very interesting that I truly felt that, and that never crossed his mind before. Another thing that I know I said a lot when I was single, and I know a lot of people say too, is, well, I've been rejected before, so why keep trying? And this is something that in the online dating world is such a popular thing to think and feel, because when you're swiping left and right, you're getting rejected more times than you probably would in real life based on probability. So when people find that they're getting rejected, whether it's sending messages, never hearing back, or going on a couple of dates and getting ghosted by a person, how do you tell people to keep trying or to take that rejection and move forward with it?
I love this idea of like focusing on how you show up rather than what you get. So rather than defining your success by how many people want to ask you on a second date, really measuring your worth by like what you offer. Like, are you offering someone a kind ear? Are you trying to be present rather than try to analyze like what they think of you and what you think is going to happen next? I think really like having the courage to repeatedly show up with curiosity and sort of really be mindful, like approach each date, because it's kind of like a person that is pursuing the job search. Like it's just kind of a matter of like good fit and timing and opportunity. There was a TED Talk that I loved that I'm forgetting the speaker's name, but he talked about like having this tremendous fear of rejection, and so setting out to do things each day that he was sure would guarantee rejection. And his goal wasn't to like get a yes, but his goal was just to like stretch himself. And so I think approaching dating in that way, and he was really surprised a lot of the things that his mind told him would never work out, he actually, a lot more people were willing. So when he did things like approach someone and say, hey, can I plant a flower in your garden, they were more inclined to say yes than he might have assumed. And so I think really like a huge mix of like self-compassion, like being nice to yourself, realizing like of course it's really hard to be rejected. It's incredibly painful. That's one of the reasons I wrote this book, because rejection leads people to feel like their life is less meaningful. Of course it's hard to be rejected, and just because someone rejected you doesn't mean that's anything personal to you, and that doesn't mean it's going to transpire tomorrow.
It's so true to remember that rejection in life and dating is not always so personal. It could be about what the person has going on in their life. It could be because they're not ready to date. It could just be because they're already seeing somebody else. But we take rejection so personally, and you're right. It's a really a good thing to A, get comfortable with it because it is a part of life and dating, and B, almost separate yourself from it. One thing that you write in the book is that it feels sad to me that women are given advice like act like a lady, think like a man. And one of the most popular books I remember when I was, I think, a little bit older than a teenager to read was that book about acting like a bitch. He'll like you because you're a bitch, or whatever it was called. Men Like Bitches, that was the book. That became like a Bible for women to read. And I read through it and I thought to myself, this is so complicated. Love and dating shouldn't be like this. I shouldn't be playing a game with a person to get them to like me. But that is such common advice, is to think like a man and don't text somebody back for 3 days. You're not about that. When you give advice, that's not what you say to do. So what kind of advice do you have for women who feel like they need to change themselves and the way that they act in order to be happy and find a person?
My biggest message is my hope in writing this book was to sort of strip away that like mud that made people sort of doubt themselves, and for people to get really clear about like what is it that who are they, and how do they want to show up, and like your ancestors connected deeply and they didn't read these books and just psychologically like suppressing or trying to put on a show or acting different than how you feel really affects how you experience like joy and your ability to connect with people. And people are much more able to relate to people that are authentic and genuine. And it's like, like this, back to this question about rejection. If you're like putting on a facade and acting like aloof, that's not a rejection about you. That might be a rejection of that persona that you're embodying. So I think it's a real problem. And I wrote this book, How to Be Single and Happy, in response to those books, because it just blew my mind. Like I'm really in a uniquely wonderful position that a lot of my patients are like so smart and so lovely and like the most charismatic, great women that are then trying to follow these like recipes to not be themselves. And it really honestly breaks my heart. And that's sort of what moved me to write this book. And it's kind of mind-blowing to me. I'm sure if anyone out there wants to take a look today at the top books on Amazon on dating, some of these books still are, in the headlines. And, one of my hopes is that as time goes on, my book kind of like catches up and becomes sort of the place people go where they get in touch with themselves and their like values and feel like that's their defining roadmap rather than some, gaming strategy.
I really hope so too, because I think before you get a little older and wiser and go through a lot of dates, when you read a book like that, you think, okay, I'm just going to memorize this and do this step-by-step plan. And you find yourself maybe finding a person, but you're not yourself. And a lot of drama and bad things happen when that happens. So I think the older you get, it's and this is exactly what I think your book teaches people, is the more you are yourself and comfortable with yourself and understand yourself and doing hobbies that you like, the more you'll attract the right person. And I think that you're right. That's a strategy that I really hope people adopt. The last thought I have that a lot of single people have, that you do talk about in your book, and I was talking to a friend yesterday about this, is that everyone else seems happier than I am. And that's something with social media these days. It's pretty easy to feel like that. You know, you'll see people posting pictures and writing these things almost daily. I love my partner so much. They're the best. I couldn't live without them. And a quote from your book is, the prettier the picture, the less truth it tells. How do we try to be happy when we're also addicted to social media, scrolling, seeing all of these things and comparing and contrasting our lives? How do we stop doing that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real challenge, and I think it's a huge dilemma. I mean, it's like a patient of mine once called me and said, this is like, you know, she wasn't on social media, but I think this is just like a great story to illustrate how much worse it's gotten. But she said she didn't have a nice time at this event because everyone seemed like they were having a better time. And that was just like looking at a couple people, and like, imagine if you could look at like 2,000 people, and it could be just exponentially so much worse. But I think really realizing that, like, you know, a picture is just a picture, and a big sort of principle that I believe in is that a meaningful life is more important than like a superficially looking like it's perfect life. And so just realizing, like, you know, everyone has filters, people have strategies. It's hard for me to imagine, like, I think if maybe each person could think about their happiest moments, like in those moments, were you concerned about taking the perfect picture, or was it more about, and then there's, you know, a lot of research on mindfulness, being present in the moment, and happiness. And one of the biggest, studies is that the happiest man, according to neural correlates of joy, was a mindfulness expert who like meditates all day. And taking a picture is not being in the moment. And so just realizing that someone that's taking a picture in that moment is diminishing their joy. And look, we all have this urge to like sort of keep up and like passively consume. At the end of the day, we're tired. We don't want to like read a book necessarily. So like find something to do that will inspire you, that maybe is a passive form of consumption, but that's interesting and uplifting. And like maybe you could even just think personally, like, what are the costs and benefits of looking at social media when I'm away, or when I'm feeling lonely or bored? What if there's something better? Like, I'm obsessed with, like, you know, following Humans of New York, or something inspiring like your feed, or a podcast that really like moves you or touches you, or get involved in something that makes you feel like, I think when we compare ourselves to people that are struggling more, we're in a position of gratitude, and when we compare ourselves to things we know little about, we're just not.
You're so right. And the little about thing is so important, because just because you see a picture of a person smiling on social media doesn't mean you know their life, doesn't mean you know the struggles that they have. So it's very hard to just look at that picture and assume you know everything. You did mention mindfulness, and that's one of the techniques that you use a lot throughout your book to help people understand that you should be enjoying the moment. How or why should you be mindful on a first date? How can that change the quality, perhaps, of that first date?
Well, if you're present in the moment without judgment, you're not picking yourself apart, you're not making assumptions about the person. It's so tempting, especially if you've been on a lot of dates, to carry some sort of like healthy skepticism, or try to come up with some sort of like hard and fast rule, like, if this person does this, then they're not for me. And I think we really narrow our headspace and our heart space when we come up with like limiting conclusions. And I think especially, you know, a lot of my close friends and patients that have been on a lot of dates, it's like, oh, another date. And it could just be like, this is like kind of nice. I get to talk to a new person, and this might be like a really great place for a good cup of coffee. And it doesn't have to be this whole story of like another bad way to spend my time and waste of time. Like, you know, this might be a way to connect with someone in an interesting way. And I just feel like life is too short to like assume the worst.
Definitely. And to put so much pressure on a date. You know, sometimes you walk into a date and you think, okay, in 5 seconds, I have to know if I'm going to spend the rest of my life with this person. Well, that person on the date's also thinking, how's this going to go? And both of you are at high tensions. You're both not really yourself. I do think that mindfulness is an amazing practice to help you calm down on a date, but also in real life when you have different thoughts that you're stuck in. A quote that was one of my favorite, I have many favorite from your book, was, you don't need to live in fantasy, but you surely don't deserve to prepare for tragedy, which I think is very, very powerful, and also sort of filters into a section of your book called Ruminating Will Ruin Your Life. And you talk a lot about ruminating. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. So a researcher, her name is Susan Nolan Hoaxema, she passed away recently. She set out her career as a psychologist asking this question, like, why are women twice as likely as men to be depressed? That's a pretty big numbers difference. Like, why are women twice as likely? And the reason is women tend to sort of get stuck in their heads and mull over and analyze and sort of get into like this, like, you know, horrible, like nauseating cycle of like, you know, coming up with conclusions and linking current pains to past pains. So ruminating is kind of obsessing in a non-productive way. And some people wrongly assume or have the assumption that it's going to help with problem solving, or they're going to come up with some magic solution, or it's like processing. But actually it's just like predictive of incredible pain, depression, things like binge eating, substance use, anxiety, even like burning out relationships. So I certainly, you know, think a lot of times, you know, if let's say you go on a bad date and then you think about like, this has been going on for 5 years and, you know, your friends met their partners so easily and it was like their third date and it was so like lucky, and it's not fair. It's not just like an unpleasant night, but it's like an unpleasant 5 years and a terrible, you know, upcoming 10 years. And it just becomes like this moment can be hard enough. We don't need to like add like the burden of the past and the anticipated burden of the future to something that's already taxing.
Yeah, I this is the first time I really understood what ruminating meant, and I was like, wow, this is truly exactly what I've been doing for my entire life. I think I'm queen of ruminating just because I overthink everything and attach a current thought to a past thought. But ruminating can go the other way too, where you go on a first date with somebody and you obsess over them. This person's amazing. I can't wait to have a future with them. They're perfect. They do no wrong. I know everything about them. And then as the dates progress, you start to find out, oh my God, I was wrong. Or they instantly prove you wrong and you see them with another woman or something like that happens. So that's the flip side of ruminating, right? Is not being in the moment, seeing what is really there, but assuming things about the other person. And how could that hurt dating as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think then the disappointment is just so much worse if you went from like meeting your soulmate to the person being a totally, not who you thought they were. So I think, as smart as you are, as creative as you are, like I really invite people to sort of put those things on hold when it comes to like making assumptions. Of course, if they're facts that you're getting, then that's a different thing than ruminating. If like someone tells you on their first date that they are going to be moving and you know for a fact that you don't do well in long distance relationships, that's not ruminating, that's like knowing yourself. But if you come up with some story that this is the best person ever and you're going to make it work and you'll see each other twice a month, then that's kind of like unhelpful. And it might seem like not being kind to yourself to sort of not take your thoughts seriously. But I think we could all sort of like parse through like what is helpful in moving me towards my best life and like what is not helpful. And like even if a thought's true, like maybe it's not helpful, like if I was late to a meeting and I don't hear back from the producer who I was supposed to meet with, like, is it helpful for me to keep thinking like she's not calling me back because I was late? Or maybe a more helpful thing would be just to send an apology and tell myself like I can't control the past.
Yes, amen to that. Take action so that you don't assume things and you end up in a rabbit hole that spirals you into many different places. A big part about your book is helping people figure out what makes them happy, what's their mission, what can they do that they truly enjoy. And the big question that a lot of people in our You're Not Getting Any Younger Facebook group always ask is, I don't want to go online and date anymore. I'm either of a certain age or it's just not working for me. So one of the things that you talk a lot about in the book is figure out what your hobbies are. But that's not an easy question, because some people might say, well, I don't have any hobbies, I work too much, or my hobbies are things I do solo. What kind of advice do you have for people so that they can truly narrow down and figure out what are some things that they truly enjoy doing?
This is a good question. I think one of the risks, especially if you're feeling more sad or down, is that you might not enjoy things as much as you used to, or also constantly asking yourself like how much you're enjoying something is kind of taking you away from actually doing it. So I think really like not putting tons of pressure, but thinking like, if I felt great and if I was sure that I would meet someone next year, like what are some of the ways I would want to spend my time? A huge, politely recommended pursuit that I hope people encourage, and I talk a lot about in the book, is volunteer work. And so maybe even not focusing on like what's going to make me happy. Is it ceramics or is it studying Spanish? Like, thinking about like what is upsetting to me today in today's world and what can I do to make a difference. And it might not be a direct correlation that like I volunteered this thing and then I meet someone great there, but maybe you volunteer there, that improves your mood a little bit or gives you this sense of like self-acceptance and a dose of like compassion for yourself and joy, and maybe that leads you to like sort of like be more smiley in your workplace and seem more open to starting conversations, and maybe you strike up a conversation. Maybe it's not a perfect recipe that you go find 5 great hobbies and you'll meet 5 perfect people, but I think it's about you and like what's going to bring you joy. And truly the science of happiness is doing things that are like give you a sense of pleasure and also accomplishment. And this busyness thing is like something that I think is so common for us to stumble into, but like really thinking strategically, like if you could track how much time you're spending on social media, and I mean this in like the nicest way, like a good friend, if you tracked how much time you're spending on social media, how much time is that? What if you like divided it in half and gave like some of that time to something else that excites you?
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember the word you. I think when we're single, we think about where are the people at that we're trying to attract. So maybe that means they're at sports games, or maybe that means they're at clubs. What happens if we start going to places that we don't enjoy to meet people, like a club, if we're not the kind of person who likes to drink or be in that environment? What happens then?
I talk a lot about that in my book because I think it's sad. Like, let's say a person's working really hard, which I'm sure so many of your listeners are, and then they fill their free time with, instead of things that they might enjoy, things that they think they quote unquote should be doing. It's really stressful and taxing, and it's like a terrible, like other authors talk about this, like an unpaid internship, doing stuff that you don't enjoy. So I think, really like focusing on the things you enjoy is going to set you up for success. Going somewhere that is not your thing, just in hopes of meeting someone, is like going to distance you from like yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's so important because a lot of times when we're single, we're like, okay, we're just going to go out to the club and a bar and we're going to meet somebody. And then you look around the room and then you just find yourself talking to friends, feeling so discouraged because now you've convinced yourself, well, I can't meet anybody online and I can't meet anyone quote unquote offline, and that's it. But I think volunteering is such a great way, and there's a part of your book where you talk about ways to soothe yourself when you're down, and one of the things you talk about is worthlessness. When you just feel like you are down, one of the best things you can do, you say, is to contribute to others. Another part of that is that you say for self-criticism, when people find themselves just looking at themselves and saying, you're this, you're that, you're this, you're that, what's something that they can do to break out of that mindset?
Yeah, I think even just noticing that and really like breaking up with that to their core values. And it's going to be really hard to like beat yourself up if you're like throwing yourself into a meaningful activity. Like if you're engaging with someone in a meaningful way, if you're calling like up, I think sometimes people think like volunteering is like some like 6-month commitment at the hospital and they have to get all sorts of shots. It's like a whole big thing, but it could even just be something small, like sending a friend of yours going through a hard time a care package. And so chances are, if like you do that, you're not going to be full of self-critical thoughts when you're standing in line, like at the card store, or writing a cute thing down. It's going to be sort of like consuming and competing with that. And I think just realizing like what is the benefit of beating yourself up? Has that actually like changed you? And how can you sort of like realize actually like self-compassion, a lot of people doubt this, but self-compassion is much more effective in changing behavior than self-criticism.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true, but often so hard to go to, because when you're feeling down, you just pick yourself apart rather than show gratitude and say, I'm happy that I have this, and I'm happy that I do that, and I'm happy that I am this. And I think that mindset is so powerful. The final section of the book I want to talk about is when you talk about acting opposite to live differently. And I found that very powerful as well. So what do you mean by that practice?
So it's so tempting to act the way we feel. But if we want to change an emotion, we need to do different. So for example, if I'm really afraid of public speaking, which is somewhat true, I used to be very afraid of public speaking. If we're really afraid of it, it's really tempting to sort of say, like, I don't do that. No, thank you. I'm not going to give the toast at my friend's wedding. I'm not going to be a bridesmaid. What does that do? So the emotion is fear. The urge is to avoid. But if the emotion is fear, what would acting opposite be? It would be to approach. So to say, sure, I would love to, and then not beat yourself up before and after or over prepare. And there's actually a really popular program called Toastmasters where people face their fears head on. So, I've personally done this. I don't enjoy public speaking, but literally, I shouldn't say that. I actually thought I didn't enjoy it, and I do now that I've approached it so many times. But anytime someone asks me if I want to speak, I notice all the stories, like a lot of what we're talking about. I noticed all the thoughts of I'm not good at that. I'm not going to sound smart. It's just interesting. Our mind comes up with the craziest conclusions that probably aren't based on reality. I'm sure if you gave out a survey and said, did you enjoy Jenny's talk? Hopefully I'm assuming people would say sure, but my mind would say it was terrible, waste of time. No one wants to hear me again. And so doing the opposite is sort of changing how you feel by doing different. And I really highlight the purpose isn't necessarily to feel better, but to live better, because a big sort of thing that I truly believe is that the goal of life isn't to feel happy and comfortable, but to stretch yourself and live in a meaningful way. And I want to say that all the things we talked about are really hard in the book. It's really specific and exactly how do you break up with rumination, and what do you do when self-criticism is really loud, because you can't just tell yourself stop. It's like saying don't worry. But I go into a lot more detail of exactly how to change these really long-standing patterns.
You do, which is why it's such an interesting book. And again, I don't think it's for people who are just single. I was telling my married friends about this yesterday. I'm like, I got to get you a copy and you a copy. And, don't let your husbands think that I'm trying to make you single again. It's truly just a book about how to change your behavior, find happiness, and you never know what that could bring you. So I do think it's very powerful. The final quote I want to end on is when you said, and I loved this one, I think this was my number one quote, "You are a whole person and your partner is a +1." And I think that oftentimes when we date, we don't remember that. So what did you mean by that quote?
I think implicit in the term soulmate, it's you're half or something, or you're not enough. But I really want people to remember that you don't need to carry yourself with shame or say just one if you're going to a restaurant by yourself, but you could say one, please. You're enough. And especially during this time, it's 2018, time's up. We're sort of in this moment where a lot of people are embracing feminism, to really realize you can chase your best life regardless of who's standing by your side. And of course, it's understandable to want someone by your side, but you don't need to feel you can't live shame-free until that happens.
Amen to that. I want to end this with one final question. Fill in the blank. You're not getting any younger, so
follow your values and be kind to yourself.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Jenny Taitz. Please tell our listeners where they can find out more about you and also pick up your book.
My website is drjennytaitz.com, and you can find me on Twitter as well. And my book is on indie books and Amazon and hopefully your local bookstores. And I also just want to let you know that a portion of proceeds is going to women's charities. One is Girls Not Brides, and another is called Distributing Dignity, which provides feminine products for people that can't afford it. So I hope the book not only enriches you, but also enriches women around the world.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. Hey, you. Thank you for listening to the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast. There are hundreds of thousands of pods out there, so thank you for listening to this one. You can find the show notes for this week's episode up on our website, anyyounger.com. Subscribe, rate, and review the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast on iTunes so that other ears around the world can listen too. Oh, and join our secret You're Not Getting Any Younger Facebook group, where over 1,000 people are talking about how to disrupt their lives, for a good reason, to make it count. Until next week, all my love, Jen Glantz.